Good afternoon. Thanks for coming to the breakout session. For some reason, I keep getting volunteered by our marketing guys to come and do these things. So I think this one I'll do really badly, so they stop asking me. So that to set your expectation up front. I'm Barry Sandles. I'm a solution consultant with Infor. Essentially, that means I look at businesses, see what their pains are, and try and work out how we can help you. But today I'm here to talk about science, but specifically science to do with talent. So I've got a presentation which normally takes 45 minutes, and I've only got half an hour. So strap in, because it's going to be fast and furious. I'll try and leave some time for some questions at the end. Anything as I go through, please stick up your hand or throw something at me. So I thought I'd start with what does science look like in HR? Science and HR are two words that aren't put together very often. So on the left-hand side there, I think we have motivation, a bit of electricity. We have some skills transfer in the middle here, and we have some wellness and well-being stuff on the side. That may be what science looks like to you, but for when I asked this question, we did a webinar on this subject a few weeks ago. Some of the answers I got about what science and HR is, we got answers. It could be reporting, it could be using some data, we're getting closer, and also some people saying some predictive analytics about HR data. And it's this last one really, the one that I want to talk about, using predictive models. So historically, yes, you can report on lots of HR data, you collect a huge amount of HR data, but what do you do with it? How does it help you? How does it help you make a difference to an organisation and to an organisation's strategy? So that's what I want to talk about. So at Infor, we call talent science is analytics for talent. And we're taking workforce data, which could be whatever you've got, because as we know, in lots of organisations, you have some data and not others, but have some workforce data, but also some behavioural insights. So a different dimension about the talent. So what makes them tick? What makes them perform in their role? Not just on a skills basis, but a cultural, cognitive and behavioural basis. And from that, we can have some predictive talent analytics. And that can be different stages of the employee life cycle. So from recruiting the right candidates, through talent management, through learning and development, through succession planning. This extra dimension can be used to try and help the business outcomes that HR are trying to drive for the business. So what I want to talk about a little bit is how in your organisations now, predictive models are probably still being used already, but maybe on the business side, not on the HR side. I want to talk a little bit about that first part of the employee life cycle with candidate sourcing. So talent science in real life, what does it do? Then we'll talk about past that first step. So knowing your data and knowing your people and how this science and this analytics can help in that process. And then the last one is what can you do about it? So predictive analysts, already in your business, if you're like an automotive industry, it used to be that you'd have a big stock of exhausts ready for when you got to that part of the process, the drive time process. That's not the case in manufacturing anymore. It's just in time, it's lean. They predict forward what they're going to need, and at that point, just at that point, is when the stock arrives, because they can't afford to have the stock sitting around anymore. And that's using predictive models. And they use the predictive model in with marketing as well to say, well, what are we expecting? What are the buying trends? Who do we think is going to be buying our product and when? And that's predictive analytics as well, using the data that they've got, which is historical perhaps, and predicting it forward. So your organisations are probably doing some of this, but there's no reason with the data that you've got, we can't do this in an HR environment, specifically to do with talent. So some of the things you can do with talent science, some of the obvious ones is about how long people are going to stay in the organisation and how well they'll perform. They're the two key real ideas behind talent science. You want people who will stay. We're talking to some people in the sessions there about how much it costs to recruit people. Now it's about 50%, at least 50% of their salary will be taken in recruitment. And then you took the add-on for learning and development, the add-on for the quality impact that you may have by having to get new people on board. The first one is reducing turnover, increasing performance. So what metrics, say if you're a retailer, metrics about sales per hour, hitting targets, those type of metrics are things that we can use talent science for, but in a predictive fashion. So rather than recruiting people based on gut feeling, based on maybe some MSMEs getting in a room and saying, we think a good salesperson has high ambition, we think a good salesperson has some low analytical skills. That's looking at some of the salespeople from Infor have low analytical skills. But is that a predictor? Is that a good way of saying whether this candidate is likely to perform in the business? And that's, for this first bit of the cycle, that's what we're after. Another interesting one is actually increasing diversity. We found that because of the way that our talent science model is structured, it's not predicated on age, gender, sex, race, ethnicity. It has actually been proven to improve diversity because the candidate pool isn't being selectively filtered. You're getting everybody. What does that look like? We've talked a little bit about this first step of candidate selection. And quite often, and you may do this in your organisations, in the candidate selection process, you have a pre-employment assessment of some description, which may be some simple screening questions all the way through to psychometric tests. There may be lots of different ways that you try and pre-screen candidates before they come into the business. And historically, that's based on these guys getting in a room saying what makes a good person for this role. So a good person exhibits these traits. They are analytical, they're ambitious, they do these things. But if you had a salesperson role, that would be a different profile than if you wanted a project manager. Two completely separate metrics, and neither the twain should meet because they're two completely different things, and often designed by two different groups of people, which gives you no sort of cross-organisation method. There are all these little silos of pre-employment assessments. The approach that we've taken is slightly different to that, which is to have the same assessment no matter what role that you're going for. So looking at your behavioural, your cognitive and your cultural DNA. So what makes you tick? And because it's the same assessment no matter what role you're going for, if you think about the life cycle of an employee, not only does it help in candidate selection, so who's a good person to fit the role, but also are they a good fit for the next role? Are they a good fit for the succession planning? Yeah, where in learning and development can we move them forward? So this is one set of DNA. What makes you tick from a behavioural, cultural and cognitive basis that can follow you through your entire life cycle as an employee? And what that means is that a candidate would take the assessment, obviously mobile enabled, web enabled, all that sort of stuff, take the assessment as part of the pre-employment process, the same assessment no matter what job you're going for, and from that it will extract your DNA, what makes you tick. Yeah. And the key then is to compare what makes you tick with a performance profile. And that performance profile we'll talk in more detail in a moment, but that performance profile is what makes someone a good performer in the role that you're applying for. Not just some generic role, but in your organisation, in that role, who is a good performer and what makes them tick? And how well does your candidate match that profile? Because it's a fairly good predictive indicator that if somebody who's a good performer in your organisation has certain traits, bringing in a candidate with similar traits or the same traits is a predictor that they are likely to perform well. So it's a slightly different approach. And the system would give you a report and say this is how well they fit to that performance profile. And this is where data becomes more important because yes, here we're talking about some behavioural profiles, but the data you have as an HR organisation goes further and beyond that. So this is just one angle that you can look at. And the way we build the performance profile is to look at who is good in your role now. But not just who's good, who's good, who's not so good, and who's really not so good in that role now, using whatever performance data you've got. So in a sales organization, that might be quite straightforward, sales per hour, hitting targets, those types of things. In other parts of the organization, there may be softer ones, it's more hard to quantify. I know in the other room they're talking about how employee surveys are dead, but maybe employee surveys is one way of finding out who's a good in their role. I'd say 50% of the time organizations have performance data, 50% of the time they don't. Yeah. But the important thing is we get incumbents, so at least 40, so we need a fair number of incumbents to take the same assessment that we're asking the candidates to go through. So by going through that same assessment, we find out what makes them tick. What are their behavioural, cultural and cognitive attributes, their behavioural DNA as we call it. So if we know what makes them tick, and we know from performance data who's a high performer, a mid performer and a low performer, we can design a performance profile which tells us which attributes are a differentiator between high, mid and low performers. Because we're interested in a differentiator. Because it could be someone who's a low performer has very high ambition, but a high performer has very high ambition as well. So that's no predictor. That won't tell us where they're likely to be a high or low performer. It just tells us they have high ambition. So it's important to have that stepped understanding between what's the difference between a high, a mid and a low performer. On each individual trait, we do 38 different traits that we're tracking. And this is what it would look like. I'll zoom in a little bit on ambition for a good example. So here, this red square is where the candidate has scored. So this is, for me, going for whatever job I'm going for, this is the level of ambition I exhibit through the assessment process. Now, in a traditional environment, you'll say, well, they've got a mid-level of ambition. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It's quite subjective. If you've got a number of people in a room and asked them whether ambition was good or bad for that role, you'd get a whole range of different answers. But the science is here. We're using the data to say that the people who perform best in this role have ambition in that range. So now we're saying, yes, you perform here, and actually that's quite a good fit to the people who perform well in that role now, from this individual trait, just one of the 38. But the important thing to say is this a predictor? Is ambition a predictor of someone's performance? So do the high, middle and low performers have different levels of ambition? If they all have the same level of ambition, it's great that I'm scoring in the middle of this, but it could have 1% impact. It's a very low impact on whether it's a good predictor of whether I'm going to be a good performer in the organisation or not. If you think about a high turnover environment, retail or hospitality, we'll deal with some of the big department stores who have, in 1 year, will recruit over 10,000 people. So if you think about the process from a recruitment manager point of view, or may even be a store manager point of view for the store doing it, they're getting thousands of CVs. How do they pick the top 10 that they should interview? If nothing else, think about nothing else in the process about their performance going on further into the business, but how do they pick the 10 people to interview? Alphabetical, A's, B's, C's and D's, because how else are they going to do it? Well, here you can say, well, there's 4 different stages of qualification, and the system will say these are the top guys who do map very well to the performance profile for the role that you're after. So those are the guys that you should be interviewing. These guys that are middle, maybe they're your second choice, bottom choice, don't interview these people. That makes sense? How do we know it works? This is the key, because at the moment that's all great science, all great theory and concepts, but how do we know it works? Every single time we do this, we do a post-implementation study. And if we're thinking about life cycles of employees, you can't do a post-implementation study a week after you've implemented or a month after. You need a year or 2 years of data to say, is there a difference? Yeah. So here's one which is 1,800 nurses, so fairly low number really from our point of view. And here we've said in nurses recommended versus non-recommended, the difference in turnover was 51%. So those nurses that were recommended via the tool are 51% less likely to turn over. And that's a real metric. That's been studied over a year. And by different profiles there, different types. Let's have a look at another one, which is a much bigger organisation. Anyone who watches Friends, this is one of the department stores in New York that they like going to a lot. I can't say which one, you have to make it up yourself. 17,000 employees over 2 years. And this is a slightly different metric, sales to goal. Those who are recommended with the tool, more than 9% better sales to target goal. And also the turnover, 29% difference in turnover. The best metric I've got really though is that this is a yearly subscription service, cloud, multi-tenant, and the renewal rate is over 96%. So the return on investment must be there, otherwise these organisations simply wouldn't be renewing the product. So that's the talent science in practice. That's what we've done with it, in this case, just for that selection part, just for that first part. But what about further into the life cycle? What about the more day-to-day running of the organisation? This information can follow you. So some of the questions that I'm guessing you see on a day-to-day basis as HR practitioners. Here we're saying that now, using this talent science, we can get to the candidate selection process onboarding, but then into coaching, development, performance management, succession planning. Take it all the way through the life cycle. And one example of this would be looking at your team structure. This is talent management in this case. And the next slide's got more detail. But here, how good a fit are your team, both on a skills basis and a behavioural basis for the roles that they're in? So if we look at a typical XY axis here, if someone's got a good behavioural fit and a good skills fit, you'd say they're positioned for success. You know that they're likely to perform quite well. Equally, someone at the bottom end, less well positioned. But what can you do about it? As HR professionals, what are you doing to enhance those employees? You don't want them to turn over, you want to make the best of them. Two different things. You could increase their skill level by training, link into learning management systems and say, what skill courses should you take to improve your skill profile? But equally, some coaching. If there are some behaviours that we can improve by coaching, so respect for authority is one my boss told me when I did this. I wasn't very good at respect for authority. Some coaching may be required to help me with that. It might change me a little bit, it might not change me a great deal. But the idea is try and get teams that are a good fit together. So everyone being up there would be great. Everyone being down there is bad. But more likely, you're going to have a team with people spread over. So what's your strategy? You've got visibility, that's the first key. You've got a visibility, and at the moment you've probably got this visibility of the skills profile, but you haven't got the other axis of the behavioural profile. So the idea is try and move people in the team. You may be tempted to drop those guys off the bottom, but in fact what you should do is still move them where you can in the team. But it's an extra dimension, it's a dimension you don't have now. You have the data now. You know who's a good performer, you know the performance profiles, you know attendance data is another good example. If you're doing the surveys, you know who's happy. As they said in the keynote, 33% is about your line manager, 33% is about your peers. So who's filling in those employee surveys saying, my manager's above average? That's a good indicator. So again, taking this to the next level, there's data in lots of different systems. We can start building even more sophisticated predictive models, which isn't just using behavioural, isn't just using skills, but is also using all this data. So employee referrals, who's referring lots of their friends to be employees? Probably a good indicator that they're happy. Yeah? Whose attendance data from time and attendance is good or bad? That's probably a good indicator. And you have all this information, you have all this data, but without the science, it doesn't mean anything to you. So the predictive models going that step further from just the onboarding and just the talent management is saying, let's build a much more predictive model about my workforce. So I can predict in 6 months, in 9 months, in 12 months, what my turnover is likely to be. But more importantly, what is the outcome? We heard in the keynotes about what the business drivers are. So what is it that you're trying to achieve? Data for data's sake will get you nowhere. Yeah? So what is it you're trying to achieve? What is the issue? And what data do you have to back it up? Which is the next step. So rather than going from talent science, it's now HCM science. It's everything to do with HR. It's not just about that talent pool in the first place. So in the strategy for the business is, what are we trying to achieve? Yeah? Having data for data's sake is not going to help you. The next one is then identify the issue that's stopping you achieving that strategy. So what is in the way? Is it people in the way? Is it trainings in the way? Is it the business is in the way of itself? What is the issue? And only then should you think about the data. Quite often it's done the other way around. What data do we have and what does it tell us? Well, okay, that's okay, but you'll be struggling under mountains of data for months and not actually get any outcome from it. So what's the issue? What data do you have? And then what model can you build which will give you help you with the outcome from that data? And that data's TNA, that data's wellness, that data's behavioral, that data's skills, all these different aspects, which at the moment are probably all nicely siloed and never come together. So the evolution of this science and the predictive models, the next step is, again, what they were talking about this morning, which is AI. It's machine learning. And if you go on the Infor website, our president, Duncan Angove, is all over this. It's one of his favourite terms, is machine learning. And that's the next step. The next step is not you looking at all this data, but systems looking at this data for you and telling you beforehand what's going to happen in 6 months, in 9 months, in 12 months, to align with your strategy. So I'll stop there. I could go on for ages, so I'll stop and I'll ask if there's any questions.
With things like the predictive hiring modelling, how do you avoid just hiring more of the same? So, for example, I used to work at a bank.
Yep.
It was predominantly white males. So do they tend to think the same and your models will just encourage more of that thought?
No, is the short answer. The way that the system's been designed, we started with over 10,000 different questions, which pull out different bits of your DNA, different ways of thinking about different things. And they've designed the system so that it doesn't matter what age you are, what sex you are, what ethnicity you are, the answers are, what's the word? The same. It's probably a cleverer way of saying that, but it's the same. But then you're right, the issue is on the performance profile side. So if your top performers are all white males, then there is the risk that you will get lots of white males. But we have our own industrial psychologists, PhDs in the US, who work with every single project to make sure that the profiles that are being created are not railroaded. So if you take, say for example, 40 of your staff to go through the process, if you're getting a very standardized answer, they can say, well, is that what you want to do, or do you actually want to move the needle? Yeah, because there's an element of, yes, what's good in the role now, but there's also an element of what's best practice. So what do other organisations do to try and move the needle, try and move their processes? So the software is great, and the software is very clever, but there's still an element that we have our industrial psychologists. Every single project has an industrial psychologist involved to do exactly that. Make sure you're not getting the same thing. Any more? Stunned silence. Ask me one geography. Go
on. When I've tried to do this kind of stuff, one of the big challenges has been putting the data sources together. People start getting concerned about how you're going to match this different data, how you're going to match the individuals across all these different sources,
yep.
And how you're going to make it secure.
Okay, let's take those one at a time. The first one is, if you think the way we're doing the assessment isn't predicated on anything in your organisation. The assessment is our assessment to find out what makes you tick. So that's the first bit. And the only bit of information that the system needs is normally what your ATS would need. Just needs your name and address. Well, not even your address, your name. would be enough to register. So we don't need to know anything about your background, your ethnicity, your skills, or anything else for the assessment. So there's very little data in there which could be termed or deemed as sensitive. Now there's a different angle in Germany especially, that they're saying you can't capture information about my behaviours. That's a slightly different issue. And to be honest, we're still working with some people in Germany to work that one out. But in Italy and other places, we don't have a problem with that. Security, it's in the cloud. It's hosted by Amazon. And Amazon spend more on security than probably any individual organisation could ever spend on data. So it's secure from their point of view. And pulling the data together from different sources, as I said, for the performance profile, the performance profile is for a specific role. So if you're looking for a salesperson in Germany, then the performance profile is based on salespeople in Germany. Okay? And that will be different to salesperson in France because they have different cultural and behaviours. And what makes a good person in France doesn't necessarily make a good salesperson in Germany. So they're actually two completely separate performance profiles. How you determine whether they're a high, low or mid performer is, again, as I said, that's a bit of a piece of string, that one. It depends what data you've got, really. And it could be quantifiable, like sales, or it could be softer. It could be based on their performance assessment. There's no right and wrong answers. I say more 40-50% of the time we end up deploying surveys to managers and people to try and capture that information about who's good and who's mid and who's bad, but if your organisation doesn't have it. About 50% of the time.
How are those roles created? I'm confused from Grimshaw Architects, and so we recruit for architects.
Yep.
Do we then, are we in control of the profile that we create?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Because the way we do it, if we went to the previous slide, it's about your incumbents. So if you don't have about 40 people in the role, you won't get a statistical sample to make it really worth doing anything. But you can still use a best practice profile in that case. Some of our guys in the US actually do specifically CEO recruitment. Now you haven't got 40 CEOs in your business, so you've got to start working with best practice profiles. But if your organisation, you send 40 of your existing people through the system, that will tell us where the green bars are, with a bit of tweaking from the industrial psychologist if needed. So that is yours. That is specifically for you. Those green bars for that role, for your organisation, will be yours. And then any candidate is just overlaying their own red square onto that.
Are those the 3 areas that you look at?
There's a few more, but yeah. There's 38 in total.
30, right, okay.
Yeah. But
What are
there's
they based on?
behavioural, cognitive, and cultural traits. So, and some of the questions are things such as highly agree, disagree, those type of things. So I listen to my manager, disagree is in my case. But also things like numerical reasoning is in there, analytical skills are in there. And the assessment is designed in such a way that you can't fake it, because they ask the same questions in lots of different ways. And the system will actually identify people who are trying to fake the system. It's got built-in safeguards. So someone answering A all the time, for example.
So it doesn't do anything on their technical skill level?
No.
It's just about their behaviour?
Yeah, behaviour. Yeah. Behaviour, cultural and cognitive. So numerical reasoning, linguistic reasoning, those type of skills. It's not a skill profile. You can do, I think, do the skills in parallel.
Got it.
Any others? How are we doing for time? Just about out of time. I'll take one more. Nope. Well, we're just outside here in front of, we're also in the room. Come and find us. Any other questions, feel free to come and find me.